To today's hearing of the Subcommittee on Fiscal Responsibility and Economic Growth. I am pleased to be working with Ranking Member Cassidy on this hearing on promoting competition, growth, and privacy protection in the technology sector. Senator Cassidy will be joining us remotely. We're going to do a mixed hearing with some people in person and some people remote. Under President Biden's leadership, the American economy is rebounding. The unemployment rate has dropped from a pandemic height of 14.8% in April 2020 to 4.6% today. 5.6 million jobs have been added since President Biden's inauguration, more than were added in the first 10 months of any administration since we've been keeping records. Child poverty is projected to plummet by more than 40% thanks to the American Rescue Plan. All of this has occurred despite an ongoing pandemic that has plagued us now for nearly 2 years. Families have tried to adapt, and those changes have echoed throughout our economy. Demand has shifted as people have consumed fewer services while buying more durable goods like exercise equipment and home appliances. The economy has recovered more quickly than many businesses projected, and all of this is contributing to unexpected bottlenecks in our supply chain and sporadic shortages at warehouses. And these factors contribute to the price increases for many consumer goods. But they are not the only reason that prices have gone up. Sure, giant companies will raise prices when they have to, but they will also raise prices when they can get away with it. And how do we know this? Because when companies are simply passing along their increases in costs, then profit margins should stay the same. But when companies see a chance to gouge customers, particularly while everyone is talking about inflation, then those companies raise their prices beyond what is needed to cover their increased costs. Right now, prices are up at the pump, at the supermarket, and online. At the same time, energy companies, grocery companies, and online retailers are reporting record profits. That's not simply a pandemic issue. It's not simply some inevitable economic force of nature. It's greed, and in some cases, it is flatly illegal. One reason for this price gouging is that fewer and fewer markets in America are truly competitive. When several businesses are competing for customers, companies can't use a pandemic or a supply chain kink to pad their own profits. In a competitive market, the margin above costs stays steady, even in troubled times. But in a market dominated by one or two giants, price gouging is much easier. For generations, policymakers and regulators under both Democrats and Republicans promoted free market competition. But starting in the 1970s, our government changed course. For decades now, regulators and courts have looked the other way, even as one sector after another has become dominated by one or two giants. They rubber stamp merger after merger without regard to the consequences. And when small businesses got wiped out and startups were smothered or bought out, they just didn't care. Today, as a result of increasing consolidation across industries, bigger and bigger corporations have more and more power to charge their customers any price they want. They also wield more and more power to underinvest in things like supply chain resiliency and more power to hold down wages and benefits for workers. And it's getting worse. Earlier this month, Federal Trade Commission Chair Lina Khan noted that by September of this year, our antitrust agencies had already received more merger filings than any other year in the previous decade. In fact, they are on track in 2021 to receive a 70% increase above average filings in recent years. Giant corporations are taking advantage of this global crisis to gobble up struggling small businesses and to increase their power through predatory mergers. I introduced my Pandemic Anti-Monopoly Act last year to slow down this trend and to protect workers and small businesses and families from being squeezed even more by harmful mergers during this crisis. And I will reintroduce it this year because the need is clear. The effects of limited competition in our technology sector are particularly severe, and that is why I am interested in exploring today's hearing. Limited competition in tech is having spillover effects across our entire economy. Anti-competitive practices in the semiconductor industry have exacerbated supply chain issues. Big tech firms have used their dominance to inflate prices throughout the online retail market and to subject their workers to inhumane conditions during the pandemic. And as Ranking Member Cassidy has rightly highlighted in his own work, tech firms collect and exploit sensitive personal information, often threatening national security, harming our emotional health, and discriminating against vulnerable groups. It doesn't have to be like this. With stronger antitrust laws and robust enforcement, we can ensure that our economy works for American families, not just for the wealthiest corporations. Congress could provide better tools to the FTC and the Department of Justice to investigate anti-competitive mergers and break up the companies that have held our economy down. We could also make it easier for the agencies to reject such mergers in the first place. By promoting competitive markets for consumers and workers, we can foster a stronger American economy and a stronger American democracy. So I look forward to discussing these issues today. I appreciate all of our witnesses who are joining us, and I look forward to hearing about your insights and your experiences. Next, I'm going to turn to Ranking Member Cassidy, Senator Cassidy, for your opening remarks. Senator Cassidy?
No, Senator Warren. Good morning. Thank you all for being here to today's hearing, and thank you for our witnesses for taking time to testify. Senator Warren and I have agreed to a bipartisan hearing on promoting competition, growth, and privacy protection in the technology sector. I will focus my time on the privacy aspect of this, and specifically on the data broker industry. The data broker industry, relatively unknown to most Americans, but its practices and techniques are interwoven into our lives. Data brokers build profiles on individuals about certain attributes and then sell that information to those whom they see fit or who wishes to purchase. For example, I'm a big fan of LSU football. I frequently search what's related to our new coach, Brian Kelly, upgrading from Notre Dame to LSU. That search data is collected. A profile's made. I'm a big fan of LSU football. I then receive ads about buying LSU football tickets, merchandise, etc. We all experience something similar on the internet. Multiple times a year, a company will be the victim of a hack that exposes the data of thousands, if not millions, of customers. While we go to great lengths to minimize those cyber incursions, we ignore an entire industry that transacts in much more detailed and sensitive personal information. You'll hear today from witnesses that there is very little information that data brokers cannot sell, even less data that they aren't willing to sell. I believe that few in this room would think it a good idea to sell the profiles of American service members, and that's what is happening. We should have a conversation about what American data we think is okay to be bought and sold without the knowledge of many Americans, what type of data we think is acceptable to be bought and sold, period. Should we allow a list of military personnel to be sold to foreign adversaries? Should we allow a list of domestic abuse survivors to be sold to domestic abusers? We should have a conversation about what data is appropriate to collect, what limits should be placed on the groups that collect that data, and restrictions on how that data is sold or transferred to others. We should have a conversation about all the things our foreign adversaries can do with this data. That's why we assembled a team of data broker experts to talk about the different aspects of data brokers, what's regulated, what's not, how best to move forward. Thanks again to our witnesses, and I'm looking forward to discussing the issue.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, Senator Cassidy. So we've got a great set of witnesses here to share their views on promoting competition, growth, and privacy protections in the American technology sector. I appreciate everyone being with us today. First, joining us virtually, we have Courtney Brown. Ms. Brown is an Amazon Fresh worker at the company's fulfillment center in Avenel, New Jersey, and a leader with United for Respect. She is also a veteran of the United States Navy. Second, also joining us remotely, we have the Honorable Carl Racine, the District of Columbia's first elected Attorney General. He is the president of the National Association of Attorneys General and the chair emeritus of the Democratic Attorneys General Association's Executive Committee. Previously, he was a managing partner at Venable Associate, White House counsel for President Clinton, and a staff attorney for the Public Defender Service of the District of Columbia. Third, we have Barry Lynn, who is the executive director of the Open Markets Institute. His research focuses on threats of the 21st century monopolies to our democracy, individual liberty, security, and prosperity. Next, we have Justin Sherman, the co-founder and senior fellow at Ethical Tech, an initiative at Duke University focused on research at the interaction of technology and ethics. Mr. Sherman studies data brokers and the sensitive data that they hold on U.S. individuals. Following Mr. Sherman, we have Sam Sachs of Yale Law School's Paul Tsai China Center and a cyber policy fellow at the think tank New America. Ms. Sachs is an expert on cross-border data flows and studies how the Chinese government collects and uses data. And finally, we have Ms. Stacy Gray. Ms. Gray is senior counsel at the Future of Privacy Forum. She is a data broker expert, and her research centers on the intersection of emerging technologies and federal regulation and enforcement. Increasing consolidation throughout the American economy undoubtedly contributes to the higher prices, worsening working conditions, and privacy concerns. The pandemic has not only exacerbated these issues, but has also exposed them more plainly. We can fix this together. We can make our economy work for all Americans. I want to thank you all for being with us today. I'm looking forward to hearing your testimony. So, Ms. Brown, we're going to start with you. You are recognized for 5 minutes, and tell us what you want us to know.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to share my experience with you today, Senator Warren and members of the committee. My name is Courtney Brown, and I live in Newark, New Jersey. I'm currently working at an Amazon fulfillment center and have been for 4.5 years. Before working at Amazon, I served my country as a service member in the United States Navy, and I took the commitment that I made to my country then seriously, as well as the commitment I take seriously now as a member leader for United for Respect. I'm here today, Senators, to raise the alarm about Amazon's business model because it's a threat to the working people and it's a threat to our economy. 1 out of every 150 American workers is an Amazon employee, as well as in that group there are some former employees in there. And this multi-billion-dollar corporation grew on the back of its workers by exploiting them. I'm looking to you to stand up to corporations like Amazon and protect us. The job that I do is a much-needed service, especially since the COVID-19 pandemic began. As a process guide, I'm in charge of sorting 35,000 to 50,000 groceries daily for delivery to homes in New York City and New Jersey. I'm in and out of our cooler constantly, stepping in and out of temperatures as low as -10 degrees, and picking up and setting packages down with little to no rest. The work that I do is supposed to be done with 30 to 40 people, but we operate with 25 people or less every day. Because our work is essential and our workload has increased, we need more hands on deck, not less, so that we can take turns getting breaks and getting the much needed rest. But Amazon can barely retain its workers. Amazon's multi-billion dollar wealth is made possible by offering same-day delivery, and anywhere from same-day delivery to two-day delivery. And the corporation has achieved this speed and scale through their sheer brutality, watching, timing, and punishing associates like me and my coworkers for not working fast enough and allowing associates to take time off to adequately rest and recover and to prevent burnout. From the moment we pull into the parking lot, we are monitored. And that's through every step of this facility that we take. And if we fall behind in any way during our 11-hour shift, we risk being disciplined or even losing our jobs. We are pushed to our limit to the point where we can't even take regular bathroom breaks. Often we have to run to and from the bathroom in under 2 minutes so we don't get in trouble. On top of that, the bathrooms are usually pretty gross and they're usually broken too. The constant pressure and surveillance is why Amazon has twice the level of injuries and turnover compared to similar jobs. And research has shown that workplace injury rates are higher at Amazon facilities with more robotic and automated technology. I used to be a trainer and I saw firsthand how out of 50 new hires, there would only 5 would make it to the 1 or 2 month mark, and many quit soon after due to injuries or overexhaustion. We are living in a country where machines are getting better treatment than people. The machines at my facility undergo routine maintenance checks to ensure that they don't burn out. Yet the one time I needed to take off to recover from my mother's passing back in September, I was only given 2 days to do so. 2 days to plan a funeral and process my mother's death. And so I ended up taking a month off of unpaid time, which was the only option I had at the time. And this unpaid time was only because there was a reduction in the amount of work we had. And my sister, she wasn't as lucky because she also works with me as well. And she had to literally work the day of her death as well as the day after, come to her funeral, and then return to work the 2 days later. So her entire funeral was literally scheduled around me and my sister's work schedule. Imagine we went through that while Jeff Bezos made $75 billion last year, thanks to me and my coworkers. Amazon's high-tech sweatshop caused me to develop plantar fasciitis and tendonitis, a debilitating pain in my heel and ankles, because I'm having to stand for long periods of time at work with little to no rest. There was once where the pain was so severe that I ended up in the emergency room. And because I was homeless at the time and I didn't have enough time to take off, I had to beg doctors and nurses to see me as quick as possible because I couldn't afford to lose my job and the opportunity I had, as becoming leadership. This kind of exploitation isn't just happening to me. People have been working through the pandemic nonstop because Amazon will let us take time off. Often we are so exhausted we break down and cry. And a worker of mine had to stop breastfeeding her child early due to not receiving the support when she had to pump at work. This is the type of environment Amazon is perpetuating across the country. Amazon associates have been fighting back against these dangerous conditions for years. Instead of fixing the problem, Amazon is only doubling down on exploitative model. Jeff Bezos himself recently told shareholders that he plans to use more automated control of workers in the warehouse. The worst part is that Amazon is setting up its high-tech sweatshops in Black and brown communities desperate for work. Amazon is a big numbers company. They know that there are people who look like me who have very limited choices, and they know we can't afford to complain or refuse bad conditions. Amazon takes advantage of this desperation. The pandemic has closed a lot of businesses in my area, so even someone like me who has considered looking for another job, I can't because there are no jobs available or the pay isn't enough to make rent and put food on the table. This committee is considering competition and economic growth in the tech sector. When corporations write the rules to maximize their profit, they ensure they win by all means necessary. including exploiting workers and gutting small businesses. Senators, I'm looking to you to stop corporations like Amazon for ruining our economy and dictating the workplace standards for hundreds of millions of workers like me. I'm asking you to help me put an end to inhumane, exploitive practices that leave America's workers injured, exhausted, and mentally battered each day. Our country needs elected officials to side with working people, to side with essential workers, not big corporations. Thank
Thank
you.
you very much, Ms. Brown. I appreciate your coming in and testifying. Now we go to Attorney General Racine. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman Warren, Ranking Member Cassidy, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you so much for the opportunity to testify before you today. As the first independent elected Attorney General of the District of Columbia, and also the outgoing today President of the Bipartisan National Association of Attorneys General, one of my most important responsibilities is to protect DC consumers from corporate wrongdoing, including investigating and, where appropriate, filing suit against defendants that illegally exercise monopoly power, violate privacy laws, and hurt workers. We've used our power and authority to sue Amazon in the local DC court for using its overwhelming market power. That is, 50 to 70% of all online sales occur on Amazon's platform, to control prices through restrictive agreements with third-party sellers that sell on Amazon's marketplace and wholesalers that feed Amazon's retail business. In its defense, Amazon claims that everything it does in business is all about the consumer. Well, our investigation reveals otherwise. Amazon indeed is focused, and the evidence is compelling, on one thing, its bottom line, even at the expense of consumers, like the ones it claims to care so much about. In fact, Amazon is costing all of us more money by controlling prices across the entire electronic mall. Like you, Senator Warren, I too am a capitalist. People should get paid for their hard work, creativity, and entrepreneurship. People should certainly watch their profits increase as their businesses increase. But when companies like Amazon unfairly and unlawfully increase the prices on all of us, stifle competition, and take advantage of consumers, the law must step in and say, enough is enough. Back in 2019, Amazon was facing pressure from Congress and regulators over anti-competitive behavior. And we know that the concerns around Amazon and other big tech is as bipartisan as it gets. To put regulators at ease, Amazon claimed it removed a particular clause in its agreement with third-party sellers that prohibited these third-party sellers from offering their goods for lower prices or on better terms on competing online marketplaces, including the third-party sellers' own websites. Again, Amazon claimed that it removed that particular clause. Here's the spoiler alert. Amazon deceived Congress and consumers with its bait and switch of replacing the initial terms of the agreement with different titles and different words that had the same illegal impact. Let me give an example of how this works. If I'm a third-party seller selling, for example, headphones, I do want to list my product on Amazon. Why? Because it reaches so many people. Remember, 50 to 70% of the entire electronic mall. Well, in order to do so, I've got to do the following. Sell the headphones at a price on the Amazon marketplace that allows me to still earn a reasonable profit after incorporating Amazon's very high fees and commissions. Then I'm barred from selling my headphones on any other platform including my own website, at a lower price, even though I can earn a fair profit by doing so. Put another way, I've got to build in those high Amazon fees and high Amazon commissions into every price of the headphones that I sell. Why? Because Amazon forced me to agree to that term in order to access its electronic mall. And if they find out that I sell my headphones, even on my own website, for a lower price, lower than the built-in fees and commissions that Amazon requires, guess what? You get kicked off of the Amazon marketplace and have sanctions, financial sanctions, imposed on me. This leaves third-party sellers with two choices. They can sell their product on Amazon under these extremely restrictive terms that guarantee a profit to Amazon and puts third-party sellers at risk, or they can only offer their product on other marketplaces. But because Amazon controls so much of the marketplace, third-party sellers have little choice. These agreements impose an artificially high price, as I've explained, all across the online retail space. And consumers lose in this scheme as a result of Amazon's agreements. But absent these agreements, third-party sellers could offer their products for lower prices. That's one of the bases for our lawsuits. And Amazon isn't just doing this with third-party sellers. They're also doing it with wholesalers as well. So we recently added that count to our lawsuit. First-party sellers sell products to Amazon for Amazon to resell at retail to consumers. If Amazon lowers its retail prices to match or beat a lower price on a competing online marketplace, the wholesalers, listen to this, are forced to pay Amazon the difference between the agreed upon profit and what Amazon realizes with the lowered retail price. This can lead to wholesalers owing Amazon millions of dollars. To avoid triggering this agreement, wholesalers have increased the prices on their goods and on competing online marketplaces. In other words, they've agreed to do what Amazon wants. That is, to charge consumers more for products than that they ordinarily would have to pay, but for Amazon's illegal agreements. All of these agreements reduce an online marketplace's ability to compete with Amazon's marketplace on price and result in consumers paying artificially high prices. And even outside this litigation, small businesses, of course, have complained that Amazon has stolen their business ideas and passed them off as Amazon's own. Let me give you one brief example.
Attorney General, I'm going to have to stop you here in just a minute. We've just got 5 minutes for each of our witnesses, but we're going to be able to ask you some questions because I definitely want to hear this. Is that okay?
Absolutely, Senator, and I'm happy to stop right here.
Great. Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate it. And now, Mr. Lynn, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Warren.
You need to hit your button.
Chairman Warren, Ranking Member Cassidy, members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to speak with you today on this fundamentally important topic. I am Barry Lynn, and I direct the Open Markets Institute, and it's good to see you today. Political economics is the art of governing how people compete with and exercise power over one another. An essential truth of human society is that competition among people is inevitable. What people can control is whether corporations and markets are structured to promote the liberty and well-being of the individual, the ability of citizens to make wise decisions, and the security and prosperity of individuals and of the nation. For 2 centuries, Americans were masters of engineering competition policy to achieve these ends. America's citizens used anti-monopoly laws to make themselves the most equal and free people in the world and the most prosperous, innovative, and powerful. But beginning 4 decades ago, Americans from both parties radically altered how we think about and enforce competition policy. Rather than aim to promote liberty, democracy, community, prosperity, policymakers embraced a philosophy that said we should aim to promote efficiency only. The result? The result is that today Americans face the gravest set of domestic threats to liberty and democracy since the Civil War. Today in America, as Courtney made clear, monopolists drive down the people's wages while driving up the prices the people must pay. Monopolists threaten freedom of the press and of expression. Monopolists spy on citizens, then use the people's own secrets to misinform, incite, and enrage those same citizens for profit. Monopolists tax, extort, and steal other people's businesses. Monopolists destroy better technologies and ideas. Monopolists destroy vital industrial capacities. Last year we saw this with face masks. This year with semiconductors. Monopolists create dangerous dependencies on powerful foreign states. Monopolists strip America's communities of wealth, opportunity, independence, security, and hope. None of this is new. I myself first warned of how the platform monopolists threaten freedom of expression and democracy more than 11 years ago. I myself first warned of the dangers of supply chain concentration 19 years ago. There is good news. Americans are swiftly awakening to this interlocking set of crises. Today, the great majority of Americans from across the political spectrum want to see monopolists stripped of their powers. And better yet, enforcers and legislatures are on the move. The Justice Department and FTC have brought lawsuits against Google and Facebook, and in the most democratic anti-monopoly action in U.S. history, attorneys general from 49 states, Puerto Rico, Washington, D.C., and Guam launched investigations of Google and Facebook and filed 3 additional lawsuits. Then there are the smart and urgent efforts to strengthen antitrust laws here in the Senate, as with Senator Warren's proposal, in the House, and in Europe and around the world. Perhaps most important, President Biden has personally condemned the pro-monopoly Chicago School consumer welfare philosophy of Robert Bork and Richard Posner, and restored our nation's traditional focus on protecting the American people and the nation itself from all dangerous concentrations of power and control. And in Lena Khan and Jonathan Cantor, President Biden has appointed law enforcers smart enough and strong enough to get the job done. Today's hearing marks an especially important step forward in this great struggle. It highlights the pressing need to relearn that competition policy is much more than mere antitrust law. Rather, competition policy is the combination of antitrust with trade policy, corporate governance, Wall Street governance, and industrial strategy. Nowhere is this more obvious than in addressing America's twin supply chain crises. That's why in my written testimony I focus on what lessons we can learn from the role monopolists have played in concentrating so much risk and power in our production and transportation systems, such as with semiconductors. And I detail how we can rebuild our industrial system in ways that make us truly safe, while also breaking inflation and boosting wages. Our opportunity today is not merely to rebuild what the monopolists have broken these last 40 years. It is to relearn how to use anti-monopoly laws both to imagine and make an America far more democratic, just, and forward-looking than any of us have dared imagine in a generation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lynn. I appreciate it. Mr. Sherman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chair Warren, Ranking Member Cassidy, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today about privacy issues facing American citizens. I am a fellow at Duke University's Sanford School of Public Policy, where I lead a research project focused on the data brokerage ecosystem, the multi-billion-dollar, virtually unregulated industry of U.S. companies aggregating, buying, and selling Americans' intimate personal data on the open market. Data brokers are profiting off the vulnerability and insecurity of the U.S. and its citizens. While a comprehensive consumer privacy law is vital, Congress need not wait to resolve this debate to regulate data brokerage. Today, I will make 3 points. Congress should strictly control the sale of data to foreign companies, citizens, and governments. Strictly control the sale of data in sensitive categories, like genetic and health information and location data, and stop companies from circumventing those controls by inferring data. Our research at Duke University has found data brokers widely advertising data on hundreds of millions of Americans. Their sensitive demographic information, political preferences and beliefs, and whereabouts in real-time locations, as well as data on first responders, students, government employees, and current and former members of the U.S. military. Data brokers can track and sell your race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, income level, how you vote, what you buy, what you search online, and where your kids and grandkids go to school. This harms every American, particularly the most vulnerable, and I'll focus on 3 examples. Data brokers advertise data on millions of current and former U.S. military personnel. Criminals have bought this data to scam veterans and their families because of the military benefits they get from the federal government. Foreign states could acquire this data to profile military personnel, track them and their families, and undermine national security. The Chinese government's 2015 hack of the Office of Personnel Management was one of the worst breaches the federal government has suffered. Yet in the future, there's no need for the Chinese government or many other foreign intelligence agencies to hack those databases when the data can be bought legally on the open market from U.S. companies. Data brokers known as people search websites aggregate millions of Americans' public records and make them available for search and sale online. Abusive individuals have used this data, including highly sensitive information on individuals' addresses, whereabouts, and family members, to hunt down and stalk, harass, intimidate, and even murder other people, predominantly women and members of the LGBTQ+ community. There is little in U.S. law stopping data brokers from collecting, publishing, and selling data on victims and survivors of intimate partner violence. Data brokers also advertise data on millions of Americans' mental health conditions. Companies can legally purchase this data from other firms and use it to exploit consumers. Criminals already scam senior citizens using data broker data. They could similarly buy data on seniors with Alzheimer's and dementia to steal away their life savings. Foreign governments could even acquire this data for intelligence purposes. Our research has found that companies selling this data on hundreds of millions of Americans conduct relatively little know your customer due diligence. And for those that do, it's unclear how strong it is in practice. Brokers may also make their customers sign non-disclosure agreements, stopping them from saying where they obtained U.S. citizens' information. As part of talking about data threats to American civil rights, U.S. national security, and democracy, we must focus on this entire data brokerage ecosystem. There are 3 steps Congress can take now. First, strictly control the sale of data broker data to foreign companies, citizens, and governments, which currently can entirely legally buy millions of U.S. citizens' data directly or through front companies. Second, strictly control and even consider outright bans on the sale of data in sensitive categories, like genetic and health information and location data, which is used now to follow, stalk, and harm individuals. Third, stop companies from circumventing those controls by inferring data, using algorithms and other techniques to predict things they have not technically collected. Congress can and should act now to regulate the data brokerage ecosystem and its threats to consumers, civil rights, and national security. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sherman. And now, Ms. Sachs, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chair Warren, Ranking Member Cassidy, and members of the subcommittee, it is such an honor to testify today. I am a senior fellow at Yale Law School's Paul Tsai China Center and a cybersecurity policy fellow at New America. I've spent the last decade as an analyst of China's technology and data policies, both in the national security community and with the private sector. I also advise corporations on China's tech policies. Today, I will focus my testimony on China and global cross-border data flows. While my expertise focuses on China, and I will speak specifically about the Chinese government's efforts to acquire data, my view is that the most effective solutions require that the United States put forward a more comprehensive data governance vision with stronger protections for security and privacy for all companies. Some of these risks are specific to China, but so much of this is much bigger. U.S. lawmakers have an opportunity to address transnational security threats but while also advancing a more secure, ethical, and democratic internet in its own right. The Chinese government has embarked on an ambitious national data strategy with the goal of acquiring, controlling, and unlocking the value of data. My written testimony submitted for the record has more details on some of the recent plans and directives that signal the centralization of Chinese state power of information flows within and beyond China's borders. The Chinese leadership seeks to control data as both a strategic and an economic asset. There are concerning national security risks. Beijing is already presumed to have sensitive national security information from the theft of personnel records of roughly 20 million individuals from the U.S. Office of Personnel Management, as my colleague Justin Sherman has testified. If that location, health, and social media data were to be acquired on the open data market and combined with what Beijing already has, China could target individuals in sensitive government national security positions and the military for manipulation, coercion, and blackmail. This is particularly concerning from a counterintelligence perspective. As Chinese online services and network infrastructure grow in predominance around the world, it is possible that the Chinese government could use this position to monitor data processes abroad, just as the United States had done, as shown by Snowden, in utilizing data transmissions across US intelligence networks. We simply do not know what value and harm data created now will hold in the future. But we must grapple with the implications of the CCP gaining control of information flows beyond China's closed internet ecosystem. I have the following recommendations. First, the analogy of data as the new oil is false and leads to bad policy. It assumes that data is a finite state resource, and as such, efforts by both Beijing and Washington to hoard and wall off data from each other will only lessen national power, not increase it. Instead, Congress should mandate stronger cybersecurity protections and basic standards for what data can be collected and retained in a comprehensive federal privacy law to protect sensitive American data not just from sophisticated state hackers, but also from the unregulated industry of data brokers around the world, trading in consumer data without transparency or controls. While comprehensive federal privacy law moves slowly amid much debate, having baseline rules for the data broker industry would close off a prime target for exploitation now. Currently, there is nothing in our regulatory structure that would prevent the Chinese government from buying American citizens' data. That's why bans on Chinese software applications won't make us more secure or safe. Even if TikTok, for example, were an American-owned company, it could still legally buy that data on the open market. Given this, American data is shockingly exposed and will remain that way as long as restrictions on data flows only focus on specific companies deemed adversaries. The United States should work with like-minded governments to develop a common set of standards and safeguards, perhaps building off of the initiative put forward by the Chinese government, the Japanese government, known as Data Free Flows with Trust. And I have some more specific recommendations in my written testimony. But in conclusion, inaction by the United States in offering an affirmative, compelling vision of US data governance in its own right will only make the United States less secure, less prosperous, less powerful, and allow space for Chinese companies controlled by the CCP to flourish. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sachs. And now, Ms. Gray, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Warren, Ranking Member Cassidy, and members of the committee for the opportunity to testify today. My work at the Future of Privacy Forum is in U.S. law and public policy related to emerging technology and consumer privacy regulation. And specifically, I've been asked to speak to the topic of data brokers. Privacy advocates, the Federal Trade Commission, and members of this and other Senate committees have long called for greater transparency and accountability in the data broker industry, and regulation is long overdue. Many of the most influential reports published almost a decade ago have influenced the debate, and since then, much has changed. There have been significant advances in machine learning and artificial intelligence. Adoption of consumer technology has also become universal, with 97% of US adults owning a smartphone, and most families owning, of course, many additional devices. The legislative landscape has evolved more slowly and is largely not kept up. Since 2018, California and 2 other states have passed consumer privacy laws. 3 states have established limited data broker-specific regulations, and many of these have focused on transparency through the establishment of data broker registries, while others, such as the California Privacy Rights Act, codify broader consumer rights to opt out of the sale and sharing of data. Much more work remains to be done. I'd like to make 2 points regarding data brokers and then give recommendations. The first point is that defining the very term data broker has been an ongoing challenge because it encompasses a very broad spectrum of divergent companies and business activities. The leading definition includes any business that collects and sells personal information of a consumer with whom that business does not have a direct relationship. Many hundreds of businesses fall under this definition and use data for a wide range of purposes that include many of the uses my fellow witness, Mr. Sherman, pointed out, including marketing and advertising, as well as people search databases, fraud detection, identity verification, risk scoring. Some of these activities directly benefit consumers, such as the use of data to protect a bank account against fraudulent activity, but others primarily benefit the purchasers or the users of data, such as advertisers, with fewer or little or no accompanying benefits to individuals or society. Second, the lack of a direct relationship with consumers, characteristic of the data broker industry, is at the heart of concerns around privacy, fairness, and accountability, but it also presents one of the greatest challenges for crafting effective data privacy regulation, and I'll briefly explain why. Any business with a direct-to-consumer relationship, such as a restaurant, a hotel, a retailer, even a social media network, can collect large amounts of personal information about US consumers today, directly or by purchasing it. And in some cases, those first-party companies can exercise enormous influence and market power, as we've heard. However, there's still some degree of accountability to users who are aware that the companies exist and can delete accounts or raise alarms. In contrast, a business lacking a direct relationship with consumers typically does not have the same reputational interests, incentives, in some cases legal requirements to limit the collection of data and protect it against misuse. However, a lack of consumer relationship also means that businesses engaged even in legitimate data processing or socially beneficial data processing cannot rely on traditional historical privacy mechanisms of notice and choice. Meaningful affirmative consent, or opting in, might be impractical or impossible for a business to obtain for some use cases, while opting out after the fact tends to be both an inadequate safeguard and impractical for most consumers to navigate. We know that consumers can become overwhelmed with choices and often lack the knowledge to assess future risks, complex technology, or future potential secondary uses. So what does this all mean? First and foremost, Congress should pass baseline comprehensive privacy regulation that establishes clear rules for both data brokers and first-party companies that process personal information from US consumers. It should address the gaps in the current US sectoral approach to consumer privacy, and it should incorporate, but not rely solely on consumer choice. A privacy law should also codify clear limits on the collection of data, apply accountability measures such as transparency, risk assessment, auditing, limitations on the use of sensitive data, and limits on retention. In the absence of comprehensive legislation, there are a number of other steps Congress can take to address risks related to privacy and data brokers, including empowering the Federal Trade Commission to continue using its unfair and deceptive trade practices authority through funding, staff, the establishment of a privacy bureau, limiting the ability of law enforcement agencies to purchase information from data brokers, enacting sectoral legislation for uniquely high-risk technologies such as biometrics and facial recognition, or updating existing federal laws such as the Fair Credit Reporting Act to more effectively cover emerging uses of data. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gray. Appreciate all of your testimony here. And now I recognize Senator Whitehouse for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much, Chairman Warren. I appreciate it. This is a fascinating and important hearing, and I'm delighted to have these terrific witnesses here. Facebook and Google have been profiting off some of the worst propagators, I guess you'd call it, of climate denial. The Center for Countering Digital Hate finds 10 fringe sites that fuel 69% of climate disinformation on Facebook. So with a little bit of focus, they could address this problem if it's only 10 major propagators. Google itself makes millions from Google Ads that it runs alongside climate denial content as if it were legitimate. Mr. Lin, can you talk a bit about how our information ecosystem suffers when a handful of companies control what people see and how they perceive reality, what a communications monopoly means in a world in which there is so much deliberate climate denial propagated by industry?
Thank you, Senator. No, yes, this is a fundamentally important issue. I mean, what we see today, one way to answer the question is to understand that Google and Facebook today these are the communications corporations of the 21st century. These are the AT&Ts and the Western Unions of the 21st century. AT&T and Western Union, they were prohibited by law from manipulating how people spoke to one another. Google and Facebook, their business model is based on manipulation. The reason they take in the data is in order to manipulate you. They are massive manipulation machines. The way they make their money is by renting out the manipulation machines and calling that the money that they receive, they call it advertising. So what we have is in the midst of our society, rather than sort of networks that connect people and empower people to speak with one another and interact with one another, we have machines that are designed to set people into conflict with one another, to feed them false information, to determine how people vote, and so what we have, yeah.
So they're ready, willing, and able tools for false information propagators.
When they were established, I think the idea was that these systems would be used by Procter & Gamble to sell soap and Tide. What they now do, however, is they rent themselves out to Vladimir Putin, to climate deniers, to the Chinese Communist Party, whoever comes along.
Let me switch to the data that you're talking about that they have gathered and ask the witnesses who spoke about data privacy and data brokers. What does somebody listening to this hearing need to know about what companies know about them, what data brokers can extract from what companies know about them to sell, and to what extent that information can be individualized back to them, potentially by foreign bad actors, foreign governments? Mr. Sherman is going for his microphone. Go ahead.
Data brokers know everything about pretty much every American. Where you work, where your kids go to school, how much money you make, your race, your religion, your sexual orientation. And their entire business model is that they can target this to individuals. They sell this data, they offer advertising, like Mr. Lin mentioned, for the purposes of targeting specific individuals. And so these profiles are out there on the open market for sale.
And if you were running a psychological warfare operation involving American public officials or American CEOs or various kinds of decision makers in American society, how valuable a tool would that be if you were a foreign government to be able to look into people's lives and understand not only what you directly know, but what conclusions you can realistically draw about what their shopping habits are and so forth?
Incredibly valuable for that threat actor. You can buy databases right now of what people search online, how they vote, what they think, and so it's all out there on the open market.
My time is up. Thank you, Chair Warren. If I could, I'd just add one question for the record so as not to take up too much time. But one of the things we hear in the Finance Committee a lot, our chairman has joined us, Chairman Wyden, and he's very active on this subject, is that if we make big American companies pay a fair share in taxes, that will make them uncompetitive against foreign big companies. And that's the argument our Republican friends always make. What they ignore is that when big American companies don't pay a fair tax burden, that gives them competitive advantage over smaller American companies. And obviously that plays out in this tech world because you have Apple and Google who've come up with, what do they call them? The double Irish and the Dutch sandwich and all these peculiar tax tricks that they use to avoid paying their fair share. And I'd be interested in your views, again in writing and not now because my time has expired, in how that creates competitive disadvantage with potential contenders against them for competitive advantage in the U.S., and to what extent it locks in financially some of their monopolistic power because, frankly, they put themselves into a place where they don't have to pay taxes, but all their competitors have to, or all their smaller competitors have to. Yeah. Thanks very much. Appreciate the attention to that question in writing.
Yeah. Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. A very thoughtful question. And now, Senator Cassidy, I think you're up.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you all for testifying. Mr. Sherman, I can't help but note we're on Pearl Harbor Day, and our country has come to venerate this day, but also to honor the servicemen, women, others in the clandestine services, et cetera, that offer themselves to protect us. And we rightly make a tremendous investment in the VA hospital and other services to including a suite of benefits to help these folks who have offered so much. But I'm struck when you speak about how a data broker can sell personal information on a active military personnel, I presume a veteran as well, to allow a company to basically rip them off of these benefits that they would ordinarily receive. How and where? How does someone get such information? What is the price of one military profile? And is it safe to say that companies are getting rich off of using this data to trick our service folks into giving their benefits over to the company, marginal benefit for the service person or the veteran, but great benefits for the company, and the taxpayer gets ripped off? I got at least 3 questions in there.
Data brokers are absolutely profiting off the vulnerability and insecurity of the U.S. and its citizens. That includes veterans, that includes members of the military. I don't have a figure in front of me for the cost of one of those profiles, though I can follow up on that. But all to say, it's very, very easy to find this information online and to purchase it. Our research has shown that many of these companies offering this data, whether it's military personnel, low-income individuals, whatever it is, do not do much customer vetting. They are basically willing to sell to most entities with a paycheck and an email address, with a check and an email address. And so at the end of the day, it's all too easy for people to use this as they have to scam veterans and to, create risks to national security.
Now, how do they get this information? How do they know that someone's active military, et cetera?
Because the collection and buying and selling of this information is so unregulated, it's very easy for these companies to put pieces of information together to figure out how you are. Much like they might track where you go during the day and what you spend to figure out how much money you and your household make, they might look at where you travel to figure out if you're in the military.
Now, if they, would the data broker themselves have location data that would obviously indicate that I'm spending my night on base every night, except for an occasional deployment in some place which seems to be a military zone, or are they buying this location data from others?
Likely both. Many companies collect this data directly from people's phones, whether you're working on the Hill or in the military or even in an intelligence agency, and they also buy this data from other companies.
Now, I'm a physician, so let me toss this out, and if one of the other witnesses on data brokers wishes to address, please do. The thought has always occurred to me that we have HIPAA penalties if I, as a physician, would reveal that someone was HIV positive or had a mental illness. But one of you specified that the mental illness is actually well known. Makes total sense to me. If you have location data that shows that somebody goes to work every day at a place which is known to be a mental health clinic or an HIV clinic, a treatment clinic, that they would know that the person probably is employed there. But if they go every 2 weeks or every month, and then they go to a pharmacy afterwards, they could infer that the patient is either got HIV or mental health or some other illness, but those are often standalone clinics. And so they could infer this. Is this kind of a correct kind of guess at how all this is done? And doesn't this kind of violate certainly the spirit, and it seems actually almost the letter of the HIPAA regulations? Mr. Sherman, please start, and I'll ask the others to Ms. Sachs and Ms. Gray to comment.
That's exactly the problem. That's exactly the problem with data brokers, Senator. They can basically dance around the very limited privacy laws we do have, buy proxy data, run algorithms to get that information anyway.
So this is what you were speaking of as inferring. They can infer even if they don't directly collect.
That's correct.
And they sell that data to those that might be interested in marketing to someone who has mental illness or HIV or something such as that.
Yes, they do that.
Ms. Gray or Ms. Sachs, do you all have any further comments on that? Because as a physician, that greatly offends me. Because the idea that we can infer that which is otherwise restricted is, again, it just violates that which I always kind of had in my DNA as a physician in terms of protecting patient privacy.
I'd characterize that the same way, Senator. And in fact, this is one of the major problems that needs to be addressed through non-sectoral comprehensive privacy regulation, because data collected increasingly through apps, wearable devices, and fitness devices, and devices like bicycles and electric vehicles can all lead to the type of information sharing that you're describing. Some of it when it's directly collected from consumers, and some of it when it's inferred through large data sets.
Your answer implied that my car, which is connected to the internet, theoretically at least could have a app that could theoretically at least the data broker could purchase the information related to my location data from a car which is, quote unquote, a smart car. Although I don't know why you'd have to if you could just do it from an app that was on somebody's cell phone. But is all that true?
All of that's true. Much of the commercial location data that is out in the industry, some from mobile apps, some from cars, is tied to device IDs, for example. Some of it is actually from apps when it claims to measure things like driving behavior. And all of that information is very valuable for a number of purposes. Some of it benign, like transportation analytics and urban planning, and some of it more harmful.
I'll have a second round, but I yield back, Madam Chair.
All right. Thank you very much, Senator Cassidy. Senator Wyden.
Thank you, Senator Warren, and I want to thank you and Senator Cassidy for getting into these issues. Senator Cassidy just mentioned the modern car. The modern car is a computer on wheels, and I have been investigating now for years as chairman of this committee the sleazy, unregulated world of these data brokers. And in several instances, we blew the whistle on government agencies that were too eager consumers for this information, and we pushed Apple and Google to finally get some of the sleaziest data brokers out of their stores and out of their businesses. And I'm glad we're making progress, but we've got a lot more out to do. And I want to start with you, Mr. Sherman. You made an important point with respect to how foreign governments can acquire Americans' data to run disinformation campaigns, identify undercover government personnel, blackmail government employees. And I have been working on legislation for some time now to deal with this threat. The bill will be introduced shortly. My first question to you, Mr. Sherman, is do you agree that Congress should enact legislation to strictly limit the exports of Americans' personal data to high-risk foreign nations and companies to address what is, in my view, a demonstrable national security threat.
There is a huge national security threat here, and Congress does need to control the sale of data to foreign companies, citizens, governments. As you referenced, it's all too easy to get that on the open market.
Very good. Ms. Gray, we've also been looking at this whole issue of how U.S. government agencies bypass the courts by buying Americans' data from data brokers. And so I've introduced bipartisan legislation. The Fourth Amendment is not for sale to close these loopholes. Do you agree that the government's exploitation of these loopholes is a serious problem? And do you agree that Congress ought to close these ever yawning loopholes by passing our legislation?
Absolutely, Senator. The Fourth Amendment is not for sale act is a very strong model. It's exactly what's needed right now.
And tell us, if you would, how this connects with privacy, issues, because I have also introduced another piece of legislation, the Mind Your Own Business, Act. And had that become law, I'm of the view Mr. Zuckerberg would have already faced major sanctions for behavior connected with privacy violations. But how does this whole area connect with privacy? Because on the Finance Committee, we're increasingly looking at privacy, issues. For example, we feel very strongly that wealthy tax cheats, who right now are about as likely to get audited by the government as getting hit by a meteor, we got to do more to root out that corruption. But we can do it in a way that is consistent with protecting people's privacy. I'm a privacy hawk. I'll put my privacy credentials up against anybody in the United States Senate. But tell us how this whole field connects with the broader expanse of making sure that we protect people's privacy.
Sure. Well, one of the issues is the sheer scale and volume in the modern commercial data ecosystem, and it's becoming increasingly untenable, I think, to separate the related fields of law enforcement and national security uses of data and commercial collection and uses of data that originates for a particular purpose and ends up being used for secondary purposes and being used by government agencies.
It's striking because I'm also on the Intelligence Committee, and I've come to the conclusion that privacy is a massive economic and national security issue, and you can't just separate these all out into separate boxes. This question of economics and national security and privacy are directly linked. I want to thank all of you for your good work. I appreciate Senator Cassidy's interest in this. Senator Warren has been a longtime leader of making sure that we hold these major economic forces in our country, our largest companies, accountable. And by the way, I was just in Oregon and people are asking me about these issues. Being successful and ensuring that there's accountability aren't mutually exclusive. We can do both. Of course we want our businesses to do well. Of course we want them to be profitable. But they can also be accountable on key American values like protecting people's privacy. And I want everybody to know, and I'm so pleased that Senator Warren has given us this chance, these sleazy, unregulated data brokers, I want to put them on notice today. We are going to stay at it until there are serious consumer protections, whether it's the Fourth Amendment is not for sale or other kinds of measures. There's going to be accountability in this field. Thank you, Senator Warren.
And thank you, Senator Wyden, and thank you for your longtime leadership in this area. This is how we're going to make change. So thank you. Thank you for all you've done. I want to talk about another aspect of the issues that we've raised today, and that starts over 100 years ago when Congress passed our first antitrust laws to protect both local businesses and to protect our democracy from powerful, dominant corporations that would undermine competition, crush workers, and gouge consumers. But starting in the 1970s, our government reversed course. Corporate CEOs and lobbyists push the idea that mega mergers and corporate behemoths were actually good. Economists use complicated models to say, gee, if we just let big corporations get even bigger, they would be more efficient, they would lower prices for everyone, and they would compete better on the world stage. Unfortunately, too often, that is not what happened. Take the semiconductor industry for an example. Hedge fund managers took over our biggest chip manufacturer, Intel. Intel grew its market size, cemented its dominant position through anti-competitive and predatory practices. Then, having killed the competition, the managers were free to weaken Intel's fundamentals with impunity. I'll give you just one example. From 2001 to 2010, instead of spending more money on innovation, remember, we're talking about the semiconductor industry, right? You got to stay up. Instead of spending more money on innovation, on new ideas, on more efficient manufacturing here in the United States, Intel's managers spent $48 billion on stock buybacks. They boosted share prices and executive pay while they hollowed out a once great company. So, Mr. Lin, let me start with you. You know a lot about the semiconductor industry. Did consolidation, particularly the growth of Intel, lead to greater efficiency?
No, Senator, the opposite.
Did it lead to lower prices?
Absolutely not, Senator.
Then did it at least make Intel a stronger competitor on the world stage?
The opposite, Senator.
So in your assessment, what exactly did happen as a result of Intel's growing dominance in its field?
First, one of the things, you mentioned $48 billion that Intel paid out between 2001 and 2010. The dominance allowed them to pay out much more between 2010 and 2020, actually $130 billion over the last 10 years. So the looting and sacking of this corporation grew much faster and more aggressive over the last 10 years. But this results in higher prices for the chips. It results in more power, concentration of power over workers. And it's not just people on the assembly line, but it's also scientists. It's also the engineers. I mean, these are the people that we count on to develop a better future, and we have concentrated power over them. So we see less innovation as another effect. The other effects include, this extreme concentration of capacity that we have seen in corporations like TSMC in Taiwan. And this extreme concentration where you have all of a certain kind of chip, you have all your eggs in one basket, it means that the system itself is fragile and subject to catastrophic failure. What you have is the system, it gives other powerful countries like China power over the people who depend on that capacity. For instance, by threatening to disrupt shipments in and out of Taiwan. It leads to this massive shortages, these structural shortages that we see that are leading to the shutdown of assembly lines all around the world, not just in America, but we're talking about, Ford, 50% decline in production of cars in Q2. We're seeing Toyota, 40% decline in production of cars in Q3. This equals vastly higher prices for newer cars, vastly higher prices for used cars, vastly higher prices for rental cars, and a lot of dirtier cars on our streets because we can't replace them with newer, cleaner cars.
So consolidation clearly did not strengthen our semiconductor industry, but consolidation or lack of competitors in this field did create this supply chain crisis that the pandemic has exposed. And now, as you rightly point out, without semiconductor chips, other manufacturers like auto companies can't meet demand. They're furloughing workers at the same time that orders are stacking up, all because they can't get the chips that U.S. manufacturers once supplied all around the globe. And what has been management's response to this? The same executives who exacerbated this crisis by failing to properly invest in their operations and infrastructure now are asking Congress to bail them out so they can make the investments that they should have been making years ago. Excessive concentration is a real problem. It is also a problem in our domestic logistics and supply chain operations, and it applies obviously to big tech firms. Ms. Brown, I'd like to go to you if I can. During the 4.5 years that you've worked at Amazon, Amazon has grown bigger and bigger. Its profits have skyrocketed. So let me ask, in your personal experience, have Amazon's logistical operations improved, or have things just gotten worse, and particularly with the COVID crisis? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely gotten worse as the years have gone on, especially with the pandemic. It's all about pushing out as much as possible for Amazon. It used to be about the quality that we're giving our customers. That was the number one thing. But now Amazon really doesn't care very much. They don't care about how, their workers are trained. It's all about speed and quantity. So when it comes to my facility with delivering food, we deliver broken eggs, crushed bread. We end up, sending out a lot of spoiled, food and everything. So a lot of us, we want to do good work, but it's like really frustrating because, we're at a limit for, doing such things. And for Amazon, this only means they're getting rich. They preach the customer obsession, but it's not good for customers at all. And it's not good for hard-working people at the fulfillment centers either. Workers cannot do their jobs well because Amazon wants to make more money. And that's the bottom line for them, just about as much product as they could get out and more money. And if you attempt to try and do, these things like give customers good quality, actually practice customer obsession, you end up actually getting written up and then eventually terminated. Yeah. So the bottom line is for them is all profit.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ms. Brown. Amazon's profits have exploded during the pandemic, even though deliveries have been significantly delayed and services have become more expensive. In a competitive marketplace, Amazon's rivals would be able to compete on these factors, providing more reliable service or lower prices or a better work environment. But because there's no competition, consumers get higher prices and worse services, while Amazon gets even richer. Markets can produce lower prices. Markets can produce more reliable products. Markets can produce robust supply chains, but only if there is competition. When giants are allowed to dominate an industry, everyone else pays. Thanks very much. Senator Cassidy, I recognize you.
Thank you. Ms. Gray, I'll have a series of questions for you right now. I finished up my last line of questioning, speaking about how location data could establish somebody as being HIV positive or having mental illness or the military personnel, et cetera. I understand the organization with which you work considers kind of location data to be personal information that should be regulated. Can you kind of comment upon that, please?
Certainly. Commercial location data of the nature of the data that's frequently bought and sold in the data broker industry is often tied to not necessarily name and contact information, but device identifiers, such as a device ID related to a mobile phone. That has led many in the industry to claim at times that the data is not personally identifiable, that it's been anonymized or pseudonymized or de-identified to a certain extent. And while the risk may have been lessened, the fact remains that persistent, precise location information over time is very straightforward to relate back to an individual person because our behaviors and our movements are unique over time. And so that's one of the unique challenges specific to the location commercial data industry.
I'm sorry, I had to stop my video. My phone was, my computer was about to die, so y'all are getting a tour of my kitchen. I apologize for that. Secondly, related to that, what is the difference between suppressing data? I call my data broker. I contact them. I say, I don't want my data to be marketed, et cetera. How do I ask them to get rid of it? And I'm told that oftentimes they don't get rid of it, they suppress, but suppression is different than deletion. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Sure, Senator. Suppression is an industry term that is frequently used for the purpose of describing when a company maintains a list of individual consumers or individuals or devices for the purpose of excluding those individuals or devices from their products and services, but not necessarily deleting the underlying data. And there can be a range of reasons to do that. One of them, for example, is to comply in an ongoing manner with deletion or opt-out requests that are required by some of the emerging privacy laws. For example, data brokers that automatically collect large amounts of information from public records may receive a request to delete data from an individual, delete that data, but be unable to continue to delete data on that individual in the future unless they retain a limited suppression list.
In that case, you suggest that that's actually a positive thing in which they would be using the suppression to mark this. So is it a positive or a negative that data is merely suppressed as opposed to eliminated?
I would say, Senator, that it depends on the use case. There are other higher risk marketing and advertising use cases related to suppression lists. As we've heard, for example, some marketers and advertisers wish to exclude certain segments of the population from receiving advertisements that may be deemed offensive. For example, a list of households associated with the loss of a child or the loss of a pregnancy may be a list that a marketer uses to exclude those households from receiving marketing and advertising related to baby products, right? That's an example. And so it depends on the use, and there's some risk associated, particularly with those more sensitive categories of information, just by the maintenance of a suppression list.
So there's clearly a nuance here, and frankly, if we're going to attempt to address that in legislation, we would need someone such as you and your organization to help elaborate on that nuance, because it actually sounds like it could be a positive thing, although you suggest that there is a potential negative as well. So that said, let me ask you about the next thing, because I think this is another nuance. In your written testimony, I believe it was you who spoke of the fact that this big data can be very helpful. You wish to look at, just give an example, I'm not sure it ever came to full fruition, but it has in other countries, using location data to establish who may have been at a conference in which COVID is known to have affected people, and so therefore you can do that. I know there's after Mardi Gras in March of 2020, people used location data to figure out where everybody went back to from New Orleans after Mardi Gras and where people had come from, and they were able to establish that COVID came to New Orleans from both the Northwest and the Northeast. So clearly people are using data in another sense. So what is the nuance between using the data appropriately for public health purposes, as an example, as opposed to, or maybe to let me know how congested the highway is, and should I take this route or should I take another, as opposed to be using it somewhat nefariously, if you will?
You're right, Senator, to point out that there are essentially good uses and bad uses of this data. For example, in the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic, there were large commercial data sets held by both first parties, including Google, and members of the commercial location data broker industry that provided aggregate analysis of how people were moving around to help assist public health efforts. So there are both good and bad use cases. One of the nuances here is that when we talk about fair information practices and privacy and having a realm of private life, there are increasing concerns around the fact that data is collected in the first place, even when it might be later used for good or beneficial purposes. There is nonetheless a zone of private life that I think most agree should not be intruded upon. In other cases, most consumers are aware that they're sharing location data, for example, for a particular service, and not aware that it may be reused for a secondary or incompatible purpose. And things like commercial research and public health purposes are technically incompatible purposes because that's not the reason that the data was necessarily provided. And so crafting nuanced exemptions here related to sources of data, sensitivity of data, risk related to harms to individuals and groups and society are all part of crafting effective regulation here.
And since I'll finish with this and turn it back to you, Madam Chair, but since I sincerely think, in fact, observationally, it can't be disputed, that we come up with better legislation when a hearing such as this takes information from those who are stakeholders and academics and others who analyze and try and get those nuances down. Again, I ask you to contact my staff afterwards with some idea of those nuances, and that's an open invitation to everybody on the panel. Madam Chair, I turn back to you.
Thank you, Senator Cassidy. So, as Attorney General Racine pointed out, Amazon controls 50 to 70% of the $430 billion market online for consumer goods. Prices for everything from light bulbs to mattresses to motor oil are going up on Amazon. And the question is, why is that happening? A huge part of the reason is Amazon's deliberate exploitation of its market dominance to squeeze more dollars out of consumers and third-party sellers alike. In other words, Amazon's taking a big bite out of the middle. So one of our witnesses, Attorney General Racine, filed a lawsuit this year against Amazon for this very reason. And a particular focus of the lawsuit is the impact of something that Amazon calls its fair pricing policy. And if I can, Attorney General Racine, I'd like to follow up on the example you gave to illustrate this policy. So let's say if I make earphones and sell them for $100 on my own website, I just want to make sure we're clear on all this. If I want to sell them on Amazon to access this huge marketplace online and extend my reach, I have to pay Amazon's fees and agree to their terms. And my understanding is that Amazon's fees can be as high as 40% of the cost of these goods. So thanks to these fees, let's just pick that example, I have to increase my prices to ensure that I can still turn a profit. So now instead of charging $100 for these earphones, I may now have to charge $140. But the worst part is I now also have to charge $140 on my own website and on every other platform where I'm trying to sell my headphones. These inflated prices crush American consumers. So, Attorney General Racine, I want to return to your opening remarks. I wanted to go back over the example you talked about, but you also mentioned how Amazon forces wholesalers to pay more as well. So I did the consumer part just there. Can you say a little more about how they're doing this with other wholesalers as well?
Sure. And you've captured it exactly right, Senator, which of course is no surprise to me. With respect to wholesalers, Amazon, again, forces these first-party sellers, I'll call them, to reach an agreement with them in regards to what the price is going to be. And here's the deal. If Amazon lowers its retail prices to match or beat a lower price for that initial good on the online marketplace, the wholesaler is forced to pay Amazon the difference between the agreed upon profit that they made, that they entered with Amazon, and the money that Amazon realizes after it lowers the retail price. In short, Amazon has profit protection at the cost of the first party seller. I do feel compelled to also mention, and don't take my word for it, look at the April 23rd, 2020 Wall Street Journal article written by Dana Mattioli that talks about how Amazon has scooped up data from its own sellers, these first-party sellers, to launch competing products. So not only are they crushing these first-party sellers with these unlawful agreements, that's what we allege, but they're also using data around the popularity and selling of these products to launch competitive products against these first-party sellers. Amazon can't win enough without cheating, and that's why we're suing them.
So, this just knocks me out. In a typical collusion case like price fixing, competitors illegally agree to charge higher prices. And when they get caught, they can actually go to jail under federal law. But Amazon accomplishes the same thing in-house. And its higher fees are inflating prices on its own platform, as well as in stores and other websites through these anti-competitive contract provisions with third-party sellers. And the result is prices go up for millions of Americans, and Americans can't see it. Because there's no place else to do the price comparison to see what's happening here. This price increase is entirely hidden from consumers. The price looks the same wherever they go. And it just shows up as inflation. And Amazon...
Senator, can I give you numbers?
Please.
Because I think it's going to make your point. So between 2014 and 2020, Amazon's revenue from third-party seller fees and charges grew from $11.75 billion to over $80 billion. This year, Amazon is estimated to reap over $121 billion in fees from third-party sellers. They're doing this because it's extremely profitable. They don't care that consumers are paying far too much for goods, and they are not doing what they say they're doing, which is focusing 100% on consumers. They're focused 100% on utilizing their market power to extract every bit of profit that they can.
So the question, obviously, you have to ask is how do they get away with this? And what I would like you to focus on, if you can, Attorney General Racine, is how Amazon's dominant market position contributes to this kind of pricing power that's then felt throughout our economy.
Well, I think the example with the headphones that I gave and that you accentuated, frankly, and made better, is the best example. And that is that what Amazon does is it artificially builds its commissions and fees into a product. It ensures that embedded profit that it has, frankly, continues throughout the electronic mini mall or major mall in such a way that no one, not even you nor me, the creator of our own headphones, can sell our headphones for cheaper than what Amazon and we essentially were forced to agree to sell it at. And why do we engage in that agreement? Because they own 50 to 70% of the marketplace. Look at it as a toll booth keeper. If the road only leads to the toll booth keeper can raise those prices, and you as the driver have no choice but to pay whatever they're asking if you're trying to get down that road. We think that's illegal. We appreciate the work of this great committee. We're going to make law in the courts, and we look forward to helping with respect to legislation.
Well, I very much appreciate that because I appreciate your point about 50 to 70% of the marketplace that they already own. And yet, Amazon keeps growing. And they don't just grow by sales, they continue to acquire. So back in May, Amazon announced its proposed acquisition of MGM Studios. That would be an $8.45 billion deal. Now, I wrote a letter to the FTC commissioners asking them to review the deal thoroughly and to evaluate how the deal might affect workers and prices in other markets in the Amazon ecosystem. Mr. Lin, even if the FTC wanted to oppose this huge merger, it would be a challenge to successfully block it, notwithstanding everything that we've already heard from the Attorney General and that others have testified about. Can you explain why that is?
Yes, thank you, Senator. Well, first, it's going to be very expensive in terms of the time, for this limited staff that the FTC has. I mean, they're going up against the richest corporation in the world, the most powerful corporation in the world, a corporation that can throw wrench after wrench after wrench into the mechanism. It's also very expensive in terms of the expertise they have to pay for, economic expertise. I mean, they have to put millions and millions of dollars often into the kitty to pay for economists. And this is even with President Biden's renunciation of the Bork consumer welfare philosophy, the legacy, because of the nature of the law, the legacy of the consumer welfare philosophy and this focus on efficiency continues to shape how the judiciary is going to look at this issue, and they have to be ready with this very expensive expertise. Third reason, it's just very difficult to communicate with judges in the stylized language of consumer welfare, of efficiency. It's like, this is an issue of power. It's an issue of democracy. It's an issue of human liberty. And they're being said, we have to talk about this in terms of efficiency. Judges are trained to use common sense to enforce the law, to ensure rule of law. And when you're using consumer welfare framing, you're speaking in nonsense.
Well, I really appreciate that. You noted earlier that President Biden has selected two outstanding experts, Lena Khan and Jonathan Kanter, to lead the antitrust efforts at the FTC and at DOJ. These are people who believe in competition, and they're going to build strong cases. But Congress needs to do its part. We need to make sure that they have the resources, and we need to make sure that they have the tools to be able to wage these battles. Otherwise, we're just going to continue to see companies like Amazon squeeze consumers no matter who's president or no matter whatever crisis of the day we are dealing with. So I think it's important that we step up on our side, too. Thank you. Senator Cassidy, back to you.
Thank you. It appears 5-minute limits are off, so I may go a little bit longer.
I apologize. Please go as long as you need to, Senator Cassidy.
I have a series of questions for you, Ms. Sachs. First, your testimony speaks of the need to have kind of a comprehensive arrangement between countries, or blocks, if you will, if we take the EU as a bloc, in order to have some sort of agreement. I think I'm summarizing, although I'm sure you would find nuance there. Now, the reason I say this is that I have been told that the General Data Protection Regulation of the EU risk making the EU a digital colony to the US or China. It is so restrictive that the big data sets that are required to enhance research on AI are almost impossible to construct. I don't know if that's true. You know far more than I do, but nonetheless, that's what I'm told. So there's something here. How do we allow those sort of data sets required for AI to be constructed, big data sets, if you agree that that is the case? And then how do we have a governance that would exclude bad actors? And I think folks see China with all their cyber espionage as being a bad actor, but nonetheless get the fruits of this big data. And you had mentioned specifically the Japanese with the data free flow with trust paradigm. So I think I've given you kind of a lot of directions to go in your answer. I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Senator Cassidy. I think you get at a key point here, which is that U.S. security and prosperity relies on access to large international data sets. But as with other areas of the data broker legislation that you mentioned with Ms. Gray, this one will have nuance to it. So how do we allow global data flows, but with the right safeguards in place, both at home and internationally? And I think that a big important step here is making sure that we get our own house in order first. The transatlantic data flow relationship will be key, and it's important that the U.S. put forward its own vision of data privacy first, but this should not be a copy and paste of GDPR. And the topic of this hearing focused on antitrust, I think, gets at some of the challenges, which is that one of the most important critiques of GDPR is that it may only end up serving those companies that are wealthy enough to comply with a very heavy burden that comes along with it. So it reinforces the concentration of power in big tech, while there may still be limitations on meaningful privacy protections. I think that the Japanese data free flow with trust model is a compelling way to think about how can like-minded countries come together to put in place certain standards that would allow data to flow with certain conditions in place. And perhaps there can be a certification regime drawing on some of the privacy protections already outlined in the OECD guidelines. So there are a number of directions, and this will require nuanced as well, and I look forward to helping support efforts of the committee to do that.
Now, does that require an international treaty? I mean, you're not I'm assuming you may not be an international trade attorney, but can we just basically pass legislation which is in alignment with others without having a formal treaty? Or do you have a sense of how we would go about this OCED kind of a collaboration?
You know, I think this is one that I'm going to need to get back to you on the specific nuts and bolts of the various tools that are in place. If it's all right, I'll follow up with you and your staff after.
I appreciate that. Now, Ms. Sachs, tell me, so we've learned that the Chinese government, as an example, could purchase information on U.S. military personnel and presumably location data as well. Which would be kind of interesting to see where people are deployed, wouldn't it be? To see concentration of force, et cetera. What type of force, if you know from other information as to what branch of the military they were in. But do other countries have that same sort of lax attitude regarding allowing the legal purchase of information upon their security forces? So, for example, what about China?
The Chinese government is actually moving rapidly ahead to lock down more kinds of data that are deemed vital to national security, even in the commercial sector. For example, they put in place a data security law this fall, which seeks to put forward a data classification scheme where they will move across sectors to define what kind of data would be vital to national security. They did this first in the auto sector, for example, and data deemed vital to national security has new higher bar security obligations as well as localization requirements around who that data can be shared with.
Now, I think it was you suggesting that it could be counterproductive if you wall off your data. So, and that indeed, free flow of data, again, a nuance here, free flow of data is essential to ascending economic power for a nation as a whole, with economic power, of course, being somewhat linked to national security. So in your mind, is what they're doing counterproductive? I mean, is that something we should also do, or is it counterproductive?
The Chinese government is shooting itself in the foot by, I think, overclassifying the kind of data that it deems vital to national security. But in theory, what they're trying to do is say certain kinds of data is vital to national security and needs to be locked down, and other kinds of data should flow and circulate in the economy. Now, how that's going to happen in practice is another story. But I think that there could be something we could learn here in terms of defining what is the most most sensitive kind of data. And Mr. Sherman and Ms. Gray have mentioned location data, for example. President Biden put forward an executive order in June in which he called for creating a framework to assess what the security risks of transactions involving American sensitive data should be restricted. And in that executive order, he said not all data has the same level of sensitivity. So I think one thing we can do is have a more thoughtful process following on that executive order around what kind of data is vital to national security and should be subject to higher protections, and what kind of data is less sensitive and should be subject to more international flow and sharing.
Let me finish with this, Mr. Sherman. Is there any sort of data that cannot be relinked? So, of course, we say we're going to have location data and we're going to use it for X, Y, and Z purpose. It'll be anonymized. It'll be delinked. This is very important. Maybe you just want to use it to establish crowd flows within a city for city planning, et cetera. But is there any data that cannot be relinked if you have a robust enough data set by which to compare it to?
As Ms. Gray mentioned, there is a difference between data with someone's name or social security number attached and data that does not have that attached. But at the end of the day, you can re-identify anything. As myself and others have now testified, there's so much data out there on Americans hoarded by different companies that it's all too easy to combine it to identify people by name.
Okay. Madam Chair, I'm going to sign off now because I have to transition to come in for votes. But I thank all the witnesses for your testimony, including Senator Warren's witnesses, whom I did not ask questions of, but found your testimony very interesting. And Madam Chair, I look forward to collaborating with you on future such events.
And thank you for being such a great partner on this. I really appreciate it, Senator Cassidy. And like you, I'm delighted with the witnesses that you've invited today to learn from them, and hope we'll have many follow-up questions for the record here. So thank you for your partnership. This is just the opening round, and we'll keep going on this. I've got one more round of questions I'd like to be able to ask right now. What I'd like to do now is focus a little bit about market dominance and the impact on workers. For too long, our antitrust policies have focused on prices and consumers, which is important, and the Amazon example shows that we've had weak enforcement of those policies, and that's let these big companies increase prices across the board. We've also talked about how consolidation creates other problems, particularly for American workers. Whenever these companies merge, the corporate executives like to talk about the new efficiencies. And what they usually mean by that is they're going to lay off workers and cut wages. So as companies grow more dominant, they have more and more power to lay off workers and to cut wages with no real consequences for themselves, because they know that as industries become more consolidated, workers have fewer alternatives. This means that employees who are subject to increasingly harsh, dehumanized working conditions, a worker can't just move to a better job if there's no other available employer. This is called monopsony power, and our antitrust laws need to better address this. So, Ms. Brown, if I can, I'd like to ask you a couple of questions here. You work for Amazon Fresh. And lots of people order their groceries for delivery within a few hours, never think anything more about it. But there's a grueling process that happens behind the scenes to accomplish this feat. Can you explain how conditions at your warehouse have changed during the pandemic?
Absolutely. So I'm going to paint a picture for you about what the process looks like. So as soon as you go on the website and you click the place your order button, it causes a chain reaction of people running around the warehouse to gather everything. So it's a small team of those who, they'll initially be looking at the numbers and everything and pass it down to, another squad of people who are then running around a warehouse this size, that's bigger than a football field, to then gather those items. Then it goes to an even smaller team that's usually at a max of, say, like 5 people to package those items out. And then it goes to an even, smaller amount of people where they're responsible for sorting everything depending on where it's going, on a conveyor belt. And then it goes to my people where we work on the dock, and we're responsible for sorting thousands of those orders that get to us every day for 11 hours, making sure they get on their trucks and making sure it gets to, the customers as intact as possible. So now the human toll in all of this is basically we have very few to no breaks. We work until our bodies are basically, they're past the emergency stop button. We delay bathroom breaks, we miss lunch, we can't miss work. And during the pandemic, you have a lot of us that, we're burnt out. So a lot of us, me included, we would literally take like 30 seconds to, just kind of cry it out for a little bit and then get right back to it. And then when you go home, you don't even have the energy to take care of your family if, you have kids or you have family members who are dependent on you. Things such as cleaning the house or cooking for yourself basically become non-existent on, days that you have to work.
Right. So this sounds really grueling. And I know that during these challenging times, many people across a lot of different industries have considered quitting their jobs and finding better employment. However, Amazon is continuing to grow like no other company, especially while small retailers and small local businesses are closing. So let me ask, Ms. Brown, if conditions are this bad at the Amazon warehouse, what other employment options do you and your coworkers have to be able to support yourselves and your families?
Well, Black and brown people in my, particular neighborhood, a lot of my coworkers, we don't really have very many options open to us out here in New Jersey. So most other jobs out here are warehouse jobs or retail, and those don't pay enough. Amazon pays just a bit more than them. So we're stuck, being taken advantage of in warehouses like this. And this is what they bank on. So they know we have no other choice. So they continue with the lack of, regulation and everything to protect us.
Right. So you're right. It's not an accident. As the largest employer in your industry, equipped with massive power, Amazon can pressure other companies to follow suit with its poor labor standards, or they just put those companies out of business. Now, it was announced last week that the Amazon facility in Bessemer, Alabama, that workers there are entitled to hold a new union election. And if that election is successful, this would be Amazon's first union ever in the United States. But I want to ask about the other side of that, what it's like to negotiate with Amazon if you don't have a union on your side. Amazon claims, and for this one, I actually want to quote Amazon on it. They claim that direct connection between managers and associates is the most effective way to understand and respond to the wants and needs of Amazon employees. Now, it's certainly effective for Amazon's bottom line, but Ms. Brown, can you tell us how effective this direct connection that Amazon talks about, negotiating with Amazon without a union, has been for you and for your fellow workers?
So my colleagues and I have been fighting for change at Amazon for years, and instead of listening to us and working with us to find solution, they tend to double down and continue to exploit us. So that's continuing why we speak out to improve working conditions and for executives to take us seriously. So, going against Amazon, especially when, say you're going to be written up or something, is kind of like, trying to defend yourself in court. It's usually not going to go too well.
Yeah. Well, I'm very concerned that the workers that are most at risk during this pandemic are more likely to be women, are more likely to be people of color, and of course it varies depending on the job. So if I can, this is the last thing I want to ask you here, Ms. Brown. As a Black woman, what have you observed about Amazon's treatment of racial minorities and women?
So now Amazon, they will hire any and everyone. That's true. But depending on what race you are, that's going to determine whether if you can get promoted and sometimes what you're going to be doing. Most of the workers are Black and brown, and very few of us hold high positions in the company. And it shows in the promotion process. They will promote only enough Black and brown people so that way it looks okay. But mostly they hire white managers out of school who have never actually worked for Amazon versus hiring, the majority of their workforce that's Black and brown, promoting us upward when we know the process.
Yeah.
They really don't, when they do promote you, the pay is definitely different from those who get hired from outside. So if you're a Black and brown worker, usually when you make manager, internal promotions, you get a lower wage compared to someone who is going to be coming from outside that's going to be getting a higher wage. And women, it's, even more scarce to really see us in any kind of leadership roles with any of the same responsibility and respect. They'd rather promote usually a white guy over someone that looks like me.
Well, I appreciate your testimony. You're coming in to talk to us about this. All of this suggests to me that if we really tackled the dominant power issue by fighting abusive employer practices, by limiting mergers that would harm workers, and by empowering workers to unionize, we could accomplish two important goals at the same time. We could strengthen the American labor force and the middle class, and we could advance racial and gender equity. Vigorous competition enforcement would be better for all Americans who work and better for all Americans who purchase goods. So thank you very much for your testimony, Ms. Brown. I really do appreciate it. And I now ask for unanimous consent that the statement received by the subcommittee from the International Brotherhood of Teamsters and the Strategic Organizing Center on the importance of strong antitrust policy for workers, including in the tech sector, be entered into the record without objection. So ordered. I think at this moment, the United States is at an inflection point. Wealth and income disparities are at levels that we have not seen in our lifetimes. The government's lax enforcement of antitrust laws during the past few decades is a huge part of this problem. Regulators and judges have allowed merger after merger, and the result is too little competition in U.S. markets. Dominant firms in technology are free pretty much to do as they please, including on data collection. They raise prices, they reduce wages, they threaten our privacy, all so that they can boost their profits to their shareholders and make their CEOs richer. I'm encouraged that the Biden administration is committed to stronger enforcement actions across agencies and committed to promoting competition. But Congress has to step up and do its part too. It's time for Congress to finally update our antitrust laws. We should ban all mergers involving huge corporations. The biggest companies need to compete on the merits. They need to offer better products, better prices, better service, not just buy up their rivals and then gouge consumers. And second, we have to give our antitrust agencies better tools to break up the anti-competitive deals that are most harmful to our economy, like Facebook's acquisition of Instagram. And finally, our competition policy must safeguard our workforce. Those deal synergies that reduce corporate costs often come out of the hides of American workers. Real people with families to support who deserve to work with dignity are paying a huge cost when mergers reduce competition. More than 100 years ago, our antitrust laws were not designed to promote efficiency or to increase consumer welfare. They were designed to protect people from being at the mercy of economic kings who could exploit workers and customers at their whims. Those laws were also designed to protect our democracy from the corrupt influence of giant corporations. Congress needs to do its part once again to make our economy more competitive. So, I want to say again, thank you to all of our witnesses. I appreciate your being here today. Your testimony has been very valuable and appreciate your answers. For any senators who wish to submit questions for the records, those are due 1 week from today. That's Tuesday, December 14th. For our witnesses, you'll have 45 days to respond to any questions. I want to thank you all again, and with that, this hearing is adjourned.